All right, I think everything should be up and running, despite the fact that I scheduled this live stream for 8 o'clock on last Wednesday and the time changed, so the YouTube notification was telling me that I was going to be at 9 o'clock and not at 8 o'clock, and also that I was live now simultaneously. Looks like someone's got a bug there, but nevertheless, hello, fellow Sublime Text Fanatics. Terrence here, aka OdatNurd. Welcome to tonight's live stream on Sublime Text package development. Um, Tonight is going to be somewhat of a, if you will, fact-finding tour or feasibility study, if you will, depending on how you want to look at it. Um, for something that I mentioned in the stream last week a little bit, which is a feature that maybe going to be added to HyperHelp in the future, maybe not, and sort of covering something that I discussed a little bit, but I don't think I explained it particularly well. But before we can get into that part, I have to push this key and make the introduction appear. And of course, I also have to point out that here on this channel, my personal channel, I do all of my Sublime Text live streams. So if you are interested in Sublime Text package development and want to follow these videos or hop on into the live chat while I'm doing them and ask questions, you can subscribe to this channel that you're viewing this on right now. Use the bell notification icon if you want YouTube to tell you about new videos or when I'm going live. Like the video with a thumbs up if you find it helpful, blah, 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 all that stuff. I have another channel, the OdatNurd channel, linked down in the description area below. That channel is also Sublime Text video related, but the videos on that channel are pre-planned, pre-recorded videos and not live streams like they are here. So they're smaller, more succinct, and have fewer weird errors. So you can subscribe to that channel, use the notification icon, like any videos you find. Subscribe to both channels if you are like me and a Sublime Text fanatic and can't get enough of that wonderful um, stuff. I didn't think that rhymed through very well. And of course, as always, if you have any questions on anything I'm talking about in this video or any video you need me to explain something that I maybe glossed over a little bit, or there's just something you want to explain or you have an idea for a topic, go down to the comment section on any video, drop a comment in there to leave your suggestion, or you can head on over to Twitter and send a message at OdatNurd. I'm always looking for new things to talk about. Now, what are we actually going to be working on tonight? Like as I said at the beginning, this is a fact-finding mission or feasibility study, if you will. And the general idea is the syntax for HyperHelp, my help package, is in dire need of some work. It doesn't look particularly good. It's not using scopes that follow the appropriate scope naming guideline, and I'm injecting bogus scopes into the scope chain to make things highlight the way they want. Case in point, this is a keyword other directive because I wanted it to be red. And this one is storage type class when it's not really a class, it's a key value pair, as we can see from that meta field. And of course, the perennial example is anchors have string data quoted in them so that they'll appear yellow. But this is not a string. This is an anchor. And I did that because in Sublime Text, in order to get something to syntax highlight in the buffer, you have to have a color scheme, and the color scheme targets specific scopes. And if you target a scope that isn't in your syntax, nothing's going to happen. And if you have a scope in your syntax that doesn't appear in your color scheme or have a rule that matches it somehow, nothing is going to happen. Now in order to get around this, there is on the Sublime Text official documentation site, scope naming guideline that tells you how you should be scoping things. If you're a person that's writing syntaxes, you should be trying your hardest to scope as much as possible to those guidelines. And if you are someone who is writing color schemes, you should be targeting a certain key set at a minimum of known scopes to provide syntax highlighting. And of course, more if you want to, and you can also, as a user, tweak that up as well. So for the purposes of hyperhelp, here's the situation, and this is something I said I sort of talked about last week, but I didn't really describe it particularly well. If you are a software developer, then you'll know this. If you're aspiring to software development or just learning to do package development in Sublime, this may be a learning moment. But of course, as a software developer, our jobs are to solve problems. And in particular, you are given a problem to solve. And what you do is you break that problem down into smaller, more manageable pieces. Uh, Say the example is a program where you're supposed to grab input from a user for a number, validate that it's a number, add two to it, and display the result. Now, if you are absolutely brand new to programming, you're going to hear that and you're not going to know where to even start. So you have to start breaking that down into smaller steps. How do I actually gather input? How would I validate input? What does validation even mean? How do I add numbers together? How do I print them? So you might break that down into 4 different steps. Now, someone that's more experienced in programming, maybe they can just sit down and whip that program off the top of their head because they have experience, with that particular problem at hand of gathering input. And that's just a simple example, but this applies to everything. And as I said in then the last stream, the orders of or the different ways of working on something might be you sit down and come up with that ordered list of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and make sure everything is the way you want it before you start, and then follow that like a recipe. Or the flip side to that is you just fly by the seat of your pants and say, I'm going to sit down at this computer and create Quake 5, and it's going to be better than anything id Software ever created. And all you have is where you're going, and you don't know how you're going to start. And realistically, with experience, you end up somewhere in the middle there. And the reason for that is with the experience of problem solving and breaking programming problems down into smaller, more manageable pieces, you start to gain an experience, and you find that actually the same sorts of problems crop up all the time as something that happens. And so in the case of I need to grab input from a user, you already know how to do that. You don't need to break that down into more manageable steps. You already know how to do that. And in fact, you could even get to a level where you know 4 different ways that you could gather input from the user. And in that case, you can decide based on things that you have done in the past and the experience that you've gathered, which one of those ways do I want to apply here? And maybe something you tried in the past didn't work for you, but now you think maybe it might work because there's something about this one that's different than before. Or alternatively, you might find that something that you always used to do no longer seems to work in this new situation. But that experience level is something that to strive for when you want to be a software developer. And that I am a old man, and I started programming way back when I was in grade 5. So to some degree, depending on the problem in question, I already have sort of, in my head as I'm thinking of a problem, I'm always, my mind is going around going, well, I could try this, I could try that. No, that probably won't work because of this thing that I already know, or maybe that will work. I don't know if that will work. So that's generally how I work, and I do sort of an iterative process, starting with something and building up. So although it seems like I don't have a goal, I actually do have a goal. I just haven't set the goalpost 400 yards away. I set it fairly close and see if I can achieve that, and then use it and see if I can iterate on it and make it better or add more things. So the purpose of tonight is we want to be able to, I don't know, I think, create our own color scheme for our use in HyperHelp in some fashion. Now, I have to admit, normally I don't really plan on what I'm doing, but I can't help but not think of problems and their solutions while I'm like, walking the dog or going for my morning walk. So the idea that I had to try out last week, I've already decided isn't actually going to do what I want and need it to do before I've even tried it. But for our purposes tonight, we're going to go ahead and do that anyway. So what we're going to try to do is create our own color scheme for use in the help system, because if we create our own color scheme, we're in control of the scopes and we're in control of the colors and all the rules that are matching. Now, in order to do that, in order to make it match with what the user's already using, we need to base our color scheme on an existing color scheme. You can't just, pull colors out of your butt. I mean, you can. As a programmer, I am absolutely terrible at that sort of thing. Coming up with something that looks good in a visual medium like that. So I certainly wouldn't do that. But I would also be irritated as a user if I like using these dark. I'm using Monokai as the default color scheme in Sublime Text right now. If someone told me that, yeah, you can have a help system, but you have to use colors that I decided on and not colors that you decided on. And sure, I have the ability to change that, but I don't want to try and redo a complete color scheme. So this is something that maybe will be a feature in HyperHelp a little bit down the line when we reach the point where I think I've talked about this before. Right now, HyperHelp, as we can see, is just a regular package, and that's just for development ease. It's actually supposed to be a dependency, which has a different layout, acts more like a library, and in that case, the resources like the key maps and the syntax and the menu items are going to be masked by the fact that it's a dependency. And so what we're going to have to do is create a system whereby when someone initializes the dependency, it copies this code out and into a separate package, which we would call bootstrapping the package. And as a part of that, while it's copying all these resources we've already created, we can at that point create on the fly the color scheme file that we want and put it in our package, and then use it in our help system. Now, the reason why this is a fact finding mission is there are a few ways we can go about this. There are a few things that we could do. There are some things we could try. Possibly this isn't actually needed because I haven't actually gone to the state yet where I look at the syntax and try to make everything try to match the scope guidelines in a sensible way. My gut feeling is when I do that, too many scopes are going to be identically matched by the default color scheme and not have any color differentiation, or too many scopes are just going to be outside the realm of what's perhaps normally used in a logical sense. So maybe links and anchors are both going to end up being the same blue color, or maybe both of them won't have any white, or they'll both be white and not have color. I don't actually know, but I'm not. What I do want to know is how to do something like this, how to create a color scheme, because it's something that might come up in the future. Maybe in another package, I might want to create a color scheme there to use something, or someone on a forum or in Stack Overflow is going to ask a question. I like as a developer to have those sorts of ideas. I have the idea of something I want to try or something I'm curious about. I have a strong urge to go and try and do it just to see what happens. Now, if it turns out that I do want to do something like this, then hooray, I've got a pretty workable solution. And perhaps between now and then, I might make some design decisions on how it should work and modify things accordingly. Or perhaps when it comes time, I decide I don't want to do this, or what I'm trying isn't going to work for what I want. Well, the worst case scenario there is I spent some time writing some code and I learned something and I have more experience to draw on, right? So for the purposes of this, and it's gonna, I think, perhaps kill me a little bit to do this. I'm gonna open the API documentation over in a web browser on my other monitor so that I can still refer to it. And we're going to drop out of my normal Sublime I should really get on installing GNU Step on this machine. And go to temp Bob. Now I was using Sublime Text 3180, so I'm going to deploy a new Sublime sandbox of build 3180 here in my temp directory. And then I can cd into that directory and start it. And now this is more or less bone stock. We can see what all I've done here is uh, set a couple of settings that I always like to use: the font face, the font size. I turn update check off because I have many, 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 many tarballs for Sublime laying around, so I can jump back and forth and see if things will work or not. And I have a few packages installed, but not really all of them. This is something that I have set up for a couple of reasons. One is if someone asks a question for how come this package isn't doing what I want or something like that, I can fire up Sandbox really quickly, install a package, experiment, and see what it acts like in the situation where there isn't any other packages, because that's often the first troubleshooting step. And the other thing that I use this sort of thing for quite often is what we're doing here, which is I'm going to experiment with the creation of a plugin to modify color schemes, and as a result of that, I'm probably going to at least have some color scheme things, and I'm going to be creating files. Maybe I'll have to create sample packages to be able to test things. And while I can do that in my normal Sublime build, it requires me to go back through everything later and clean things up. But it seems to me a lot easier to just set up a little sandbox type environment, and then when I'm done, I can just delete this directory and I don't even care anymore. Now, for the purposes of this, I'm going to fire up our 2-hour timer starting right now. So this is actually going to perhaps be a bit of a longer stream because I wanted to get all that stuff out at the beginning for what the actual goal of this whole thing is, right? So I'm starting the timer. Now, the first thing I'm going to want to do here is create a simple color, no, sorry, a simple syntax just to test things with. And I'll actually do that here. And I don't have really any packages installed. Huh. What does this do? Oh, look at that. Okay, we're going to call this syntax sample help. Let's say it's not going to have any extensions because it doesn't really need it. And it's going to be text.help.source, let's say. Now, the main context, let's say we need a simple match rule that matches a literal asterisk followed by one or more word characters followed by another literal asterisk. And this is because what I'm developing is going to be in HyperHelp eventually, maybe, but I don't want to develop it as a part of that because it's going to pollute my code for the time being. I'm not sure if I'm going to use it. This isn't the final version of it. And as an experience in how we'd actually do this, I want to do it the way a person might do it from scratch and not from the point of view of adding something to this particular package and this particular thing for this particular reason. And I'm going to say we probably need captures here. Now, because I don't have package dev installed, this is a bit trickier. So let's say capture 0 is going to be meta.anchor. Capture 1 is going to be punctuation.anchor.begin. Capture 2 is going to be, let's say, entity.anchor. And 3 is going to be punctuation.anchor.end. And We're going to save that in my user folder as, whoops, sample help.sublime syntax, and it generated a syntax summary, so hooray. Note that this is also using the default theme and not the adaptive theme. Maybe we'll go ahead and change that just because. Now over here in this view, I can syn sample help. So now this is a sample help file, as we can see there. I can insert a lorem. I can say star Bob star. Now, is this actually doing anything? Yes, we can see that the whole scope is text anchor source. All the text in here is meta.anchor because of capture 0 on the left. This is punctuation anchor end. This is punctuation anchor begin. And this is entity.anchor. And it's not highlighting anything. As a matter of fact, we probably should say, let's say text for that. I mean, that's not going to have any effect on the color scheme over here. But I would imagine that this would be the anchor text that, because this is what we would see visualized in the buffer, as opposed to if this was a source version and it had the text, an ID and a colon, and then the text, if you remember things we did in a few live streams ago, that would maybe have entity anchor ID and entity anchor text as two separate things, and then punctuation something for that colon in the middle. Now let's go ahead and do a similar thing for, we'll do it this way first. For, that. And now it's not anchor, it's links. And I can say this, well, let's make this text nice. This is an anchor. This is a link. And again, that's punctuation link end and meta.link. Yeah, entity link text and that. Now the scope guidelines say that you shouldn't really color things with the meta scopes. They're more for plugin use. So that's why this is meta link. So we could extract that as a link, and this is meta anchor. So we could extract it as an anchor. Now, as we can see, this has what looks to be a valid scope. It's just not syntax highlighting here at all, right? I'm going to go ahead and view.setScratch true and view.setName sample help file, just to make that tab look nicer. So maybe we don't even need this lorem text at the top. This is a big old ball of white text, isn't it? Now, if I said view package file Monokai, which is the default color scheme, we can see this is what it looks like. It has a name, an author, some variables, so we can determine colors by name and define them in the hue, saturation, and lightness color scheme. Then this global section displays or sets colors for various things like the foreground text, the background text, caret, blah, 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 using those variables, possibly also by defining new colors based on existing variables and changing the alpha. So this, for example, makes white space sort of the same color as whatever white 3 is, but a little bit darker because we're seeing through it. And what we're really interested in are these rules down here, right? So if I was to come over here and say the whole color scheme is a JSON object and it has a rules key, and that rules key is, as we can see, a list. And we'll go ahead and do that, yeah. Now, inside here are all the rules for something. So if I say that the name is anchors and the scope is entity dot, what did I even call that? I've already forgotten. Entity dot anchor, like so. And then I can say the foreground color of anchors is what? Well, we were using string.unquoted previously, right? So this is a YAML unquoted string. And that's the only thing that matches. So let's say this color with a perhaps unfortunately named variable is that color. Now I'm going to put that over here so I can save. And I'm going to go into the user package and I'm going to name this Monokai.Sublime color scheme, which is the same as the default color scheme. Because this is in my user package, it's going to be added. Well, all of the Monokai.Sublime color scheme files will be combined together into one file in package load order. And the user package is always loaded last. So my rules here are going to take precedence. Now, in theory, this means that as soon as I save this, we should see that anchor over there change to quote unquote white 3, which I think is supposed to be the yellowy color, but we'll find out. That's not going to do anything, huh? What if I did that? Well, see, things are already going wrong. Well, what if I did this? Okay, so that's doing something. So that is doing something. I just didn't pick the right color. All right, well, in that case, maybe I went the wrong way with that. Because maybe this is the one that matches better. This is why we experiment with things, right? There we go. That's a color. All right, now, how do we style those? Now, these are just punctuation, right? They're punctuation anchor begin. I think if we looked over here, here's a scope for punctuation definition. It's not that. And here's one for punctuation definition in a markup heading and a punctuation definition in a markup heading 1. And punctuation definition and thematic break definition. And what's this one? That one's also definition. That one's definition. That one is too. So many of those. So I think what we're finding here is, yeah, there's just no scope. This might have already wrapped around. Yeah, there we go. So although this is punctuation, there's no scope that explicitly matches it. So it doesn't have anything fancy going there, right? So in that case, we can say that the name is anchor punctuation. And in that case, the scope is don't do it that way. Punctuation dot anchor, and the foreground color is also going to be var yellow because we want it to be the same as the rest of the text, and that changed it. But what we actually want is to maybe say that and say now I'm going to have to look at this because I can't exactly remember the scheme for that. Okay, yeah. Whoops, that was not the key I intended to push. It's color yellow, no comma, alpha, let's say 0.6. 6. Close that. So that should dim it up a little. And it does. That's making it even darker. Okay, let's say, how about 0.25? That's too dark. Okay, we'll say 0.3 and call it good. And similarly, we can go ahead and copy this and this and that. Oh, I see what I did there. Link. This should be link, like so. That makes links the same color as anchors, but recall that I said that that was actually storage, which is var red2 instead, unless it was a storage.type, in which it would be a blue. And we can see entity.name. So this is an example of, say red2. Ooh, that alpha really messes that up. Let's maybe take that up to 6 for that one. Because maybe I did that wrong and that should have been entity.name.anchor instead of entity.anchor. These are the sorts of things that are judgment calls. If I decided that by following the specs, the scopes should be entity.anchor and entity.link because that's what they are, and these aren't names per se, they're the texts of those things, then the fact that if I didn't create these rules, they would never be syntax highlighted. On the flip side, if I had said entity.name.anchor and entity.name.link for the name parts, they would end up both being yellow because that's what this matches, names except for section names and file names, or tag names or label names. So that would be a case of that other thing I mentioned where they both end up being styled the same and we don't want them to be. Now, how could we go about actually creating this color scheme programmatically in code instead of actually doing it this way? Well, there are a couple of ways that we can go with this. So I'm gonna leave that for the time being, just for that. We'll leave the syntax open, and for now, well, let's bring that over here, shall we? Just so that we can refer to it if we need to. Now I need to create a plugin, but I don't have my normal thing, so we'll do that. And we're just going to say print example and save this as example.py, like so. And now there's a user plugin example. And then, as I've pointed out in other videos, what I generally do in a case like this is create a key binding. So where I might say keys are super plus T, because that's normally what I use to test things, and the command is example. So when I push the key, you see the command running. That way I don't have to keep going to the console and typing view.run command example or whatever. Now for our purposes, we know that we're doing this in hyperhelp, and in theory I'm also doing it as part of the package bootstrap, which is code that someone else's plugin will call as a function and not as a command, because we can't provide commands until we finished bootstrapping. So you can't start a bootstrap with a command, in which case we would probably need to define a function. So we're going to call this gen color scheme 1, let's say. And for our purposes, let's say it needs to take a view. And as such, we can call gen color scheme 1 with self.view. I don't know if this is actually what we want to do, but that still seems to work. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to do my normal thing and oops. Now I need to replace this mouse. I have one on the desk all ready to go to replace it, but I didn't get to it before the stream was about to start. Okay, so now I have a console over there. That's working. Great, great. So here was my first thought on how a person might pull something like this off. Okay, And this is what I was actually going to try last week. But during the week, I realized that what I was actually going to try to do wasn't, it, it would work and it wouldn't work simultaneously. So let's explain what I mean by that. So here's, as we can see here, we can create a color scheme by just augmenting an existing color scheme. And it's worth noting that this works whether the color scheme is an old style TM theme file, which is an XML based format, or a Sublime color scheme. Um, Internally, Sublime loads both of them and stores them in the exact same data structure. So Monokai.tm theme and Monokai.sublime color scheme will both stack with each other. So this works regardless. And here, because I'm using the name of an existing color scheme, all I did was add the rules. And of course, as you can see, I have all of this other information on variables that I can just use because my rules are just being appended to the rules. And the global colors are the same in this file as they would be in any file. And if I, was to somehow modify the file, the syntax for this to support something that Python supports, like a regular string or an integer, those would be highlighted the way we might want. So one thing we can do is just patch one, but my first thought was, why not just create an entire one of these things from scratch? And what we would do is base it on an existing color scheme and just grab the information that we need and create one of these files. So that would look something like this. So let's say, and again, let's say hard coding this for the time being to, these are the scopes that we're interested in creating rules for in our color scheme, right? But we would go about this in a slightly different way if we were going to create a color scheme from scratch. And then we're going to say that this actually returns a string. So it'll return sample, let's say. And here, um, uh, well, I guess we should do it this way, shouldn't we? We'll say self.view.replace using the edit object. We need to pass a region to replace. So we're going to say sublime.region 0 and len self.view to capture a region of the entire file, and the text to replace is that one, like so. I'm going to save that. We're probably going to be sad about that in a second, but if I run the command, the word sample appears. Okay, so this is the file that we're going to have to make sure we run our code in. Otherwise, we'll blow our plugin away and have to keep remembering to push undo. Expect to see me doing that a bunch of times. So right off the bat, the first thing we know is this file is going to be a dict of some sort. So we can say scheme is equal to a dict, and then we can return the scheme like so. And what happens when we do that over here? We actually get an error in the console for that because the Sublime API expects for you to pass it a string and not a dictionary, as we can see there. So, trivially speaking, I could stir scheme that whole bad boy, and then that'll do what we want. But probably, and I'm just looking over here in my web version of the Sublime API. We want to do this. We're going to return sublime.encode value, and the value to encode is scheme, and we're going to pass true. And we'll see what that does in just a second. So now if I do this, run the command, we get the dictionary expanded out. Now, in order to see what that's actually going to do, we might say, before we start, that the scheme name is HyperHelp generated color scheme. And we might also say that the scheme author, because we can see that over on the other side there, is equal to vaguely clever code. That just shouldn't have a comma after it. Now, if I run it again, there's the starts of my color scheme. You notice that the keys aren't in the same order as they are over here, which is, there's not a lot we could do about that unless we wanted to be more clever about how we generate things, but that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Now, the passing true for this parameter gives us that we probably don't want our color scheme to be teeny tiny like that, so we're pretty printing it, if you will. That's what that does. If not passing that value is the same as saying false, I think, but we can easily test that, can't we? Yeah, see, so there you go. So we want true for that. Now, that's the core of the color scheme. What we're actually going to want to be working on is rules. So we can say rules is going to be a list, or, well, maybe if we want to keep things looking the same way we normally do, and scheme rules is equal to rules, like so. And then we could go ahead and add rules here and encode the value at the end. And then that means we end up with that, which again is sort of what we want here. Now, how do we actually figure out what to do with this thing? Well, in that case, we would have something like this. Underscore scheme mappings is, let's say, a dictionary. That sounds like it might be good. And the key value is going to be, I'm going to move this one over here so I can refer to it. The actual scope that we want to be a rule for this. And so that means we would want an entity.anchor.text whose value is something. That still works, right? Yep, okay. Never take anything for granted. And then we would probably want the entity.link.text, which is going to be something that we don't know what yet. Entity.link. Nope, sorry, punctuation. We want punctuation.anchor over here, but spelled correctly as something. And we want good lord, punctuation.link as something. Now, what are the somethings over here? Basically, that scope that I already knew was something that was a color I wanted. So for the anchor text and for the link text, for these, we would say that the scope was what? It was string.unquoted is something that I was using for that. And for these two, it was just storage. Okay, so save that. So what we would actually do here is we need to iterate over for, let's see, the key value is going to be a scope. Well, actually, it's going to be a selector, I suppose, if we want to get technical. For selector, comma, and the value is, oh, no. That's right. This is the scope, and that's the selector, which is sort of a confusing thing. The key is the scope that we are scheming, and this is the selector that we're going to be looking for in underscore scheme mappings. And this is one of those cases where I would print scope like so. Run the command, see there's too many values to unpack, expected to, because I always forget to type items like so. And now I can erase my plugin accidentally, And I can see in the console it printing anchor text. So it's totally iterating things the way we want it to. And what are we actually doing here? We are calling view.style for scope. And the scope that we're actually getting the style for is the selector. Now, again, if I was to, whoops, print that like so, when I run the command, we can see I'm getting 4 things. And that API tells us the source file where the color was defined, and also the column and line in that file where it came from. Then it tells us what the foreground color is. If there was a background color that was different, it would be included there. And then if it's italic, it returns false or true, and if it's bold, it returns false or true. Now, something I need to double check here, because I cannot for the life of me remember how this actually works. Font style needs to be italic or bold italic. So we're going to need to do a little bit of work on that in order to make that appear in the thing. But first we have to remember to undo that so our code doesn't go away. So we're going to need to turn one of those into one of these. How do we go about doing that? Well, we know exactly what this is doing. Now, just for our own purposes, is there something in here with a background? Yes, invalid. So just for test purposes, just to show this, if I change this one to invalid, when I push the key, now we see the last one has, well, I guess not necessarily the last one because they're not necessarily iterated in any order, but now there's a background where previously there wasn't a background. And there's still a source file where it came from, and an italic and a bold, and a source column and a source line. So let's create just a quick little, we'll make a rule thing for this, and we'll call it rule for selector. And it should take a view, and it should take a selector. And then it should say rule is equal to whatever this is doing, which is that, right? And paste it here. And then we're eventually going to return rule. And as such, this now becomes rule for selector for just for view, because that's the view we're passed, and the selector that we're being provided. And it's still doing what it was doing before, but now we've hoisted the code up here. Now maybe this isn't exactly how this should go. If we think about this logically, we're going to grab, let's say, this bad boy here, like so, and drop it in here. I'm going to go ahead and just quickly zoop this out so that we can see it, and then I'll comment it out. Italic false, bold false, source column, and there, and there. Now, this is very, my puppy is having a dream about chasing bunnies under the desk. Looks like he's catching them. I guess what we could actually do is say data is that, and then we could say rule foreground is equal to data.get foreground. Now let's assume a color is just always defined. How could it not be? And what if we said rule background is equal to data.get background. I think that should just automatically default to returning none without causing an error. But let's see what that does to this. Anything? All right, it's printing something, and rule is not defined. I messed something up there. Oh, I forgot to say rule is a dictionary, like so. Okay, and I run it. I'm going to undo that, and we can see background is none. So I guess we want to do this a different way. If background in data, do that. And if we're going to do it this way, let's say for our purposes, we're going to assume, oops, first of all, that every rule that this returns has to have a foreground color. It's never going to not have a foreground color. Even if you call this for a scope, that doesn't exist. If I said view.style for scope, blah, 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 I still get an answer. What I end up with is some color, probably the text color if I had to guess, or something along those lines, but it doesn't have a background, but it always has a foreground color. If there's a background color, get the background color, return it. So that's taking care of this field. That's taking care of this field. We don't care about source. We don't care about source file, so we can delete those out of hand. And we don't care about source column. So all we care about is that. And those, as we can see, are always going to be there, right? So we might say italic equals rule. Oh, and it has to, no, it's already going to be the appropriate bool. So we're going to call that rule italic. No. Let's say this, oh, what's the actual key called? Font underscore style, did that what we discovered? Yes, okay. Font style is just an empty string. If rule bold, then font style plus equals bold, like so. We're going to add a space to that. And then we're going to say if rule italic, font style plus equals italic, and we don't need to put a space on that one. And then if font style, then rule font style is equal to font style dot trim strip. I think Python is strip, and then return it. So the idea being it's an empty string. If bold is in there, it adds bold plus a space. If italic is set, it adds italic. And then if that ends up with a string that's not empty, add it to the dictionary. So if it's just bold that's set, this will strip off the trailing space and it'll still be bold. If only italic is set, italic is the only thing that's in there, the strip is going to do nothing but waste time. And if bold and italic are in there, it's also going to do nothing and waste time. But one of the good rules of thumb is make it work, then make it pretty, which I think we've seen quite a bit. Now that takes care of both of those, and I think that means if I was to run it here, woo! What did I do wrong here? Is that not what it's called? Certainly looks like bold. Oh, because those should both be data. My bad. Of course it's not in there. Now what? Now we can see it. Woo! Messed something up hardcore there. Foreground is the list foreground. What have I done? Oh, because I made that too clever. Lord. Okay, do it over here. Now there's a foreground, there's a foreground, there's a foreground, and a background or a foreground. So all of those are working. Now, just again for our own edification here, if I change this to support.type, when I run it, that one has a font style of italic, like we would expect, right? If I was to change this to markup the heading and spell it correctly, when I run it, we see the font style is bold, like we expect. And if I changed it to this scope, which I'm just going to go ahead and copy because life is too short for my terrible typing at this point. When I run it, it says font style is bold italic. All of the situations here work. So now we don't need to print that rule. We can just say rules.append. Is this how lists work? And I think as a result, list object has no string. Oh, duh. Now that's working, but it doesn't have a scope in it. So we're going to need to add that. We're going to have to pass this as an argument. So maybe we can say scope, comma, selector, and here we can say scope, comma, selector. And then we can say rule scope is scope in our little constructor. And we end up with a scope and a foreground. Now there's not a name in there, so we don't actually know what those are for except by looking at the scopes, right? If we change this data structure, we could have an associated name in there. For our purposes, as a generated color scheme and just seeing how it works, that's not really worth our time at this point. Just because, you know, adding a dictionary key is, of all of the things we have to do to be able to automatically generate a color scheme, adding an extra key to every dictionary that tells you what it's for is the least egregious of them all. So this is actually an example of creating something like that. Right now, we are returning the encoded value of that, which is currently just being replaced into the buffer. But that's not actually what we want to do. So I'm gonna add a enter there. And we're gonna add a comment that says generate a brand new color scheme. Excuse me, for hyperhelp based on the scheme in use in the existing view. Okay, now that's a pretty small piece of code. I mean, this part's kind of long, but presumably we maybe use that later. And this can also, of course, be tightened up somewhat, presumably. I think also if we just dumped that value out here, the color scheme would be really big, but it would just have a bunch of redundant stuff in it. But I don't think it gets mad at that, but even if it doesn't, it's not something I would do anyway. We're going to change this to a window command instead of a text command, which means this no longer takes an edit parameter, which means we can no longer do that. So what we can do is say scheme data is equal to gen color scheme 1 for self.view and go back to printing it like so. So when I save that and hit the key, we can see sub dot window dot active view. For right now, that's all we need. And when I run it, now we're seeing the color scheme being generated to there, right? So all we have to do is write this thing into a package file. Now, I'm pretty sure we can say sublime.packages path and get that. And if I imported OS, I can say os.path.join for sublime.packages path. For our purposes, we're going to store this in the user package. That's not actually how this would work in the final version. It would actually take that string and add it to the zip file as it's generating the package. And we would call the file hyperhelp.sublime color scheme. Actually, we could probably use something like maybe hidden color scheme or whatever. There's a variation on the name that makes it hidden so it doesn't appear in the UI. And that's giving us the full path to a file that we care about, right? So let's go ahead and do that. We need to import OS. Down here, we would say res file is equal to that, which we would perhaps do a little bit of this just to make it look a little nicer. And then we can also, instead of printing that, print res file just to make sure that's still working, and it is. And who remembers how to write to a text file in Python? This is not something that I generally have to do on my own. So I always have to look it up in a little tutorial-y type thing in order to figure it out. Because generally speaking, I use Sublime to generate my files, right? And this is, of course, quick and dirty, so it doesn't really have any exception handling, but I could say with open res file for writing as handle.write scheme data thus. And I have to go to here. I'm going to run the command. Didn't generate any problem in the console. And what did I call it? Hyperhelp.sublime color scheme. So I should be able to say view.settings.set the setting color scheme to hyperhelp.sublime color scheme to see what happens. And whoop, this is something that I totally expected. And why is it doing this? Because if you look at this, the bulk of the file is the rules that tell it how to display various scopes in various ways. But there's this section right here, which is telling it what the foreground color, what the background color, what the caret should be, what invisible should look like, blah, blah, blah. Our color scheme didn't have that. As a matter of fact, maybe we might even close that version and say VPF hyperhelp.sublime color scheme so we can actually see what the file looks like. It doesn't have that global section at the top of it, so of course it looks like crunk, but that's actually something that we can fix as well, because we can say how do I want to do this? Global, oh, sheesh. Is global a word? Globals? Oh, I guess that is technically a valid name. It's a built-in, huh? Global colors, let's call it then, because I don't like to step on things. and we're going to say view.style. Now, that gives us a dictionary with, as you can see, selection, highlight, shadow, selection, foreground, active guide, accent, blah, blah, blah. Looks an awful lot like this, right? As a matter of fact, it has more things in here than this has currently. Monokai doesn't have an accent color specifically defined, and as a result, it's just extrapolating one. And we also find similar things because you'll notice that literally the only colors that our color scheme is applying are those ones. These two are yellow or shades of, and these two are red or theoretically shades of. Well, actually not right now because that thing is wrong. So they're actually displaying as a different thing, which is neither here nor there. But you'll notice that looks ready. That is blue, which definitely isn't any of those colors, and those dots look yellow, which may or may not be something. And as a matter of fact, if I was in this view and I did that same thing, we can see there are a lot of things that are just all white, like those, or all black, like find highlight background. But in active selection, 999, that's nothing we put in here. And various other things, like the accent color. And that's because Sublime tries to grab colors and extrapolate them. And one other thing it does, we can see here, there's this one called purplish, and this one called pinkish and yellowish, and there's a bluish. There's something that you can actually do in Sublime. Let's see if you said view.add regions. And if I remember correctly, the first thing is the region key. The next thing is a regions, list of regions. So let's say sublime.region from 10 to 20. The next thing is the scope to use to color the thing, right? And say we use storage because we know that storage is a red color, and we can say sublime.draw no fill so that it only outlines the region. And if I remember things correctly, we should see a red box appear around some text. Oh, sorry, no. Flags has to be that. There's other things like the icon it puts into the gutter if you care. So there's a box that's red, and the reason it's red is because the scope storage in Monokai is red. But what I can actually do is something like this. If I wanted to make a color that was blue, if I wanted that to be blue, one thing I could do is look in here, and none of those have blue as a name. So you would think, I guess there's really no way for me to do that. Probably, oh, sorry, that one has one, right? So if that says blue as a variable, then if I searched for var blue, we can say storage.type, right? All right, so that's something I can do. I can change it to storage.type, and now it should be a blue box instead. Okay, so that works. Now, what if I wanted something that is purple? There is a purple thing here, but what I can actually do is say region.purplish. And I did it in the wrong file, but that is okay. And now you can see it's purple. It just is a purplish color, if you will. And similarly, you can say region.reddish. And now it's a reddish type color, or region.greenish, which is a greenish type color. Now what it's actually doing is those are colors that it comes up with by looking at the colors in your color scheme and trying to find the closest matching one. So it always tries to come up with an appropriate color. But here's something weird that I noticed the other day. And again, note, these are the only 4 colors that are in here. If I do it this, I get sort of, but not quite a greenish region. And if I did it purplish, that's a purpley type color. And if I did bluish, well, if I did storage.type, it ends up being black because it doesn't know what that is. But I can say region.bluish. And yeah, those are not really colors that are necessarily in here, but it's just sort of extrapolating them. And I'm going to be unhappy that I did that because I'm not 100% sure on how you get rid of regions. Is it clear regions? It's erase regions. It's erase regions. Test. There we go. We'll go ahead and do that over in this one too so we don't go too crazy. But if I say view.style, and we get that dictionary back, we see bluish, purplish, pinkish. Those are all colors that it's extrapolated, and because this is the global styles, it's telling us what colors it would use for that. I checked. Adding those to the global section doesn't influence what color it uses. It just ignores them. So that's not something we care about. And we can now, close this one because we're generating it into that file there, right? So we can easily solve this particular problem in here by getting the global colors, which is all of that, and then saying scheme globals is equal to kv for kv in global colors dot items to iterate over the dictionary, but only if k, if not k, ends with ish. And just like that, if I run the command, it starts looking more like what we would expect, except that I should probably change this back to storage like we want it to be. And actually, you can totally see I did that wrong. The entity, the anchor text should be unquoted, and the punctuation for the anchor should be string dot unquoted. And this one should be storage, and that one should be storage. And now I have code that generates me a color scheme, applies rules for the scopes that I care about, and has the same globals as over here. So if there were some spaces here, you can see those are the same as those spaces there color-wise. That works, really good. And this is actually how I originally intended to pull this off. I could come up with this list that says on the left, all of the scopes for everything help related, whether it is a standard scope or not. And on the right, the actual scopes that I want to match from your color scheme. And if these were actual uh, scopes that follow the guidelines, then this value and that value would be the same. If I was having strings in my help file, I would say that this is string.unquoted and this is string.unquoted, and it would just look up the color for strings. And in this case, I want links to be a ready color, and I know that, well, we'll just say, a storagey type color. So that is what I'm going to use for that, and we can see it over there. And here's something I just even thought of here. Style for scope. Can I say reddish in here? It's a color that may or may not be reddish. That may actually be just the background color or the foreground color. We could test by saying bluish, and it's still the same. So that doesn't work. Does this work? That totally looks like a color that is not the same as that, and there. That's different than that. So I could actually even make this smarter if I wanted to. I could call these region.yellowish and end up with some colors over there. The problem with that is those colors don't have a background color applied. Or sorry, they do have a background color applied, I should say, along with a foreground color. That's not something that's untoward. If we wanted to do this way, if we wanted to say that these were both region.yellowish and these were both region.reddish, we could just modify rule for selector to not copy the background in, and then it would choose colors for us that were more or less the correct color. Perhaps the better way to do that than just trying to gank scopes. This is the sort of reason why we're doing this in the first place. But there's actually an issue with this, and in order to see what it is, I'm going to cheat and go to the local source hyperhelp resources directory and subble the syntax hyperhelp.sublime syntax file into this window. And we are looking for this. And which one do we want? We want this one. Let's say we're going to copy that into our sample help here. Well, I guess I could probably just do that, right? And what did I do? Line 20? Oh, right, because I didn't. That is 100% correct. So we need those two. We'll just throw them in up here at the beginning. Okay. That means in our little help file, we need to run that again to put that back. This is the thing that allows us to do this. Now, there's no scopes on that right now that are visible, but we can totally see that, right? And we can totally see that. So that's something. And this is scoped as source.python. Now, what we could do is, if we look at this, we'll find that if this code was in a markdown file, if I copied that and pasted it, it seems to be syntax highlighted in a way like you wouldn't expect. And you can see the syntax is still sample help. Why is that? Because this one's using our color scheme. This view is not, it's using Monokai. And this is the problem that I didn't realize I was going to have until I thought about it while I was walking around. Because I can add rules that make these backticks display in a certain color. And in fact, I have that in HyperHelp. You see they have inverse color, but they are also dimmed down with an alpha so you don't see them too much. And so is this. But the real issue is this right here. This is embedding the Python syntax. So this can have absolutely anything in it we want. I could copy this whole function from there to there. And its syntax highlighted the same as it is here, albeit with a slightly different background. So just doing this, grabbing the globals and jacking rules into it for our scopes is not the way to go in this case, because if I do that, then all of this text is just white, which is sort of defeating the purpose of tagging it as Python in the first place, right? And not only that, but HyperHelp currently allows you to use JSON and XML in there, and there are nascent plans to maybe try to somehow get package dev scopes and syntaxes into there as well. So this is good for what it is, but it's not going to do what we want, right? So we could say generate a brand new color scheme for HyperHelp based on the scheme used in the existing view. This returns a color scheme which has global rules and just the scope rules from scheme mappings applied. So that's one way to do it. That's the way I was thinking of doing it. That's not actually the way that it should be done. At least I don't think. What we actually want is something more like the file that I had and closed. And I'm again going to leave this open. Let me just get rid of that. We don't need this file anymore because I've stolen that thing out of it. And we don't need that file because I've stolen that out of that. So I'm going to leave that stuff in there so we can see it doing things. And VPF, whoops. Oh, I do not like that. I haven't trained this one to use the appropriate thing. User Monachi. So what we actually want to generate is this, essentially. We want rules for only our scopes instead of, well, if you will, we want to generate rules for only our scopes as we did here, like so. But instead of making it a whole new file, we just name it after the color scheme that's currently in use and add it to the package, and then it blends the way we want it to. So I'm going to close that file and bring this one. Well, no, we'll leave it over here because we're going to be working with this file. We'll be able to see it happening. So let's start another one. Def gen color scheme 2. And again, this also needs a view. Does it? Maybe it doesn't. Let's leave that out and see, because perhaps it's not particularly necessary. Well, you know what? We're going to go ahead and do it just to make this part easier. So I can copy and paste that, blank that out, change this to 2. And all this is going to do is return sublime.encode value scheme true, which I could have copied, and I could say scheme is equal to that. We don't want it to name user. For our purposes, for right now, we want it to be named Monachi, right? So when I run the command, it just gets overwritten like that, and this file goes back to something. How is that even working at this point? What color scheme does this thing have associated with it? Oh, it's still got the other one. Right. View.settings.erase color scheme to put it back to the default Monachi color scheme. So, boop, just like that. These things lost their color because this file doesn't have any rules for them. But this one now, has color. So we flip-flopped our problem by creating an empty file. And maybe we want to think about this a little bit. Let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to call this one here, for our own edification, example1 command, which does that and gets rid of that. So that's just a full example of, this should be hyperhelp. So this is the command we just had. It generates color scheme that the first way. I need to add things in here or I get all irritated that my code doesn't look the way I want it to. And then it generates a file into the user package. Again, that wouldn't be happening there later on. And then it writes it to that file. This one, we're going to have to do this a little bit differently. say. So we're still going to take a view, and we're still going to do that. We're going to have to say settings is equal to sublime dot. Do we? No. For the purposes of what we're doing here, we'll make it simple, right? So we do want a view here. And we want to say color scheme is equal to what? View.settings.get color scheme. And we can, just to show how that works, print color scheme like so. So when I hit the key, we can see it printing monokai.sublime color scheme down there, right? And excuse me, that's the default color scheme. So we're going to want to return color scheme and that. And then here we're going to say color scheme and scheme data is equal to that. And instead of naming this, we use color scheme. So the purpose of all of that is we're asking the color scheme setting what color scheme it's using. We don't need to print it anymore. We do something to generate a color scheme like we did up there. And then we return back the name of the color scheme that's in use and the encoded value of the new color scheme. And then down here, the color scheme name is grabbed and used as part of the file name. And this is just a clever way to generate the appropriate color scheme file based on what the current default is. Now, in actual use, we wouldn't want to use view settings get for this because it's possible for, as you can see, this is a window command. It's just calling it with the active view. This active view right now is a Python file. I could be the kind of guy that has a different a color scheme set up for Python so I can have different colors in Python than in my C# code or my TypeScript code. And if that's the case, the color scheme I generate would be based on this one and not based on the actual global default. So realistically, we wouldn't say the color scheme is view settings get color scheme. We would say sublime.load settings preferences.sublime settings and then get it from there. But this is just a quicker way to do that for right now. We'll do that in the next one just so we can see that working as well. And what do we want to have in the scheme? Let's go ahead and copy those two items out and those two items out. Okay, like so. Now, one thing we could do is literally, we don't need a global section because we are inheriting. So we could just grab this, right? And we could throw, whoops, this in here. And now, as we can see, help file, that's white, that's colored, that's nothing. When I run the command, there is the color scheme that I've generated, and there it is working. So this is something that we could do. That's a simple change. In fact, we didn't even need to create a different function for that. All we really had to do, as we saw at the beginning, was just change hyperhelp.sublime color scheme to color scheme and use that command. And maybe also don't generate those globals and blow them away. And this is going to do what we want. There is, however, an issue with this. And note that here in Monokai, the default one, there's variables in here that define various colors. All the globals are defined based on those colors. And all of these rules are based on those variables for colors as well. In the one we generated, there are color hexes. And that's because the view style and the view style for scope API methods return you a normalized usable color. And that means that although this works, if as a Monakai user, I decided in my user file to add a variables section and change one of these colors to something. Now let's see, what was I grabbing? String.unquoted was the yellow, like so. So just as a test, we can see perhaps see this happening. We can see those colors and those are the same, right? Because this is the anchor that I defined as a color using string unquoted. This is literally just a string. It's quoted, but it works out the same. If I added a section here that said variables, which looked like that, I think. It has to have a comma after it or the syntax gets mad. And then I copied that yellow and pasted it in here. Now, am I in any way cognizant of how HSL colors work just by modifying them? No. So let's change this to 20. It's going to do something. The hue is going to be different. I'm going to move this over to here so we can see what happens when I save this file. I changed all of the string scopes to be this sort of peachy color or something. Orangey, browny, peachy. I want to eat a peach now, I know that. But my anchor color didn't change as a result of that because it's color hex and it's not one of those variables. So that is, one could say, an unfortunate turn of events. If I was a person that was modifying the scheme, I might expect if I change the value of the yellow variable, then everything that's yellow changes to the new color, but it didn't. There's not directly an API. I'm going to have to, I'll just revert that out temporarily by rerunning the command. And now we can see my anchor color is that color and these aren't because it grabbed what the color was. I'll have to do it one more time to bring it back to what it's supposed to be. And we can go ahead and move this file back over here like this. So that's not what we want. There's no API function to directly get this. But there is something we can do to get that information. We can do this. If I say sublime.find resources and I was to look for monakai.sublime color scheme, there are two results returned. The first one is in the color scheme default package, and the other one is the user package, the one that we're generating. Because we're using the default color, we're using the color scheme that's currently assigned to something as the default, we know there's always going to be at least one. There's probably going to be more than one. Now, I've given this some thought. Here's the theory. Here's what we're going to do. We can load the contents of this resource and decode it from JSON into a regular Python dictionary, and then just examine the contents and pull the data out that we want. That's not a big deal. What we might be concerned with is, which one of these do we use? Because there's two of them. Do we lose one or the other? Now, in fact, what Sublime is doing in cases like this and for other resources you can partially override is it will gather all of the resources and load them in the order you see here. So first it loads this one into some data structure. Then it loads this one and applies this data on top of what it already loaded, which is why our version of the file can refer to variables if we want it to, even though they're not in this particular thing. For example, I could change the foreground of this to var red2, and Now, anchor text is red because it's following that variable, even though that variable isn't declared in here. So one might wonder, do we have to load this file and then load this file on top of it? Or we would have to be sure that this is the one we're creating. Don't load that one because that one's not valid. We're regenerating it, right? But maybe other packages have Monakai color scheme too. What do we do there? And I think the answer is always use the first one in the list. The first one in the list is going to be probably the package that originally declared the color scheme. Now, I can't imagine there any packages would ship with a Monakai Sublime color scheme that had different rules. If they did, they'd blend together and probably cause confusion. I think for our purposes, because we are augmenting a color scheme, the only sane thing to do is to use the first one, which is, as far as we can ever tell, the one that is the default one, that is the base one, that is actually has the information that we care about in it. And ignore the fact that any other package has one, just use this data, because any other ones that exist here are going to add to this one, and the order that they're added depends on the names of the packages that they have, that they are, because the files are loaded in a particular order. And as such, if you try to load them all up, you're going to get different results for different people depending on what packages they have installed and whether or not they have color schemes. That is a support nightmare. I'm just going to say always grab and load the first one. And so how might we pull that off? Now, again, keep in mind we're at color scheme 2. We're not generating that. We don't really want to do this per se, this rule for selector, because that's calling this thing here, which is calling style for scope, and calling style for scope isn't going to get us the information we want, right? So with that code gone, now the color scheme generates is empty, and our rules lose their syntax highlight, but everything else that's the default remains. Now here's what we can do. We can say files is equal to sublime dot find resources, and the resources to find are color scheme. And as a matter of fact, again, we're going to assume that because we are either getting this color scheme from a view, so it's already set, or we're getting it from the user preferences, whatever this is set to must be something that exists. Or if you will, if it's not something that exists, the user is really unhappy because they're constantly getting dialogue pop up saying that their color scheme is missing, and they're probably hard to read because everything's white on. So we don't really need to worry about that. So if we always want the first file, we can do that, and we can say res file is this. And again, I'm going to print res file. You see I do this quite a bit. When I run the command, that's the resource file that we're doing something with. And I'm just going to just quickly double check. Yes. Here's what we can do here. We can say JSON data is sublime.load resource, and the resource to load is the res file. Now I'm going to swap that to be from that to be JSON data. This is essentially the, if you will, quote unquote, Sublime version of this, if this was reading instead of writing. And if I run the command, the console, look, it's got a color scheme in it. I loaded that file in one thing. The reason you want to use load resource is because this works whether the file is inside a Sublime package file or not. Generally speaking, if you're going to write a package and you're going to ship it on package control, unless you are packing something that needs to be a file exposed to something outside of Sublime, you're going to leave your package installed as a Sublime package file and not have package control extract it. And if that's the case, you want to use load resource to be able to load the data. One of the more common bugs you can have when you're developing a package is to manually load data from your package by doing, again, something like this, by using Sublime Packages path and adding the name of a package and the name of some path, maybe in the name of a file. Then you use open that file for reading and read the data. It works great while you're developing your code. Then you deploy it to package control, and suddenly it starts blowing up in everybody's face because package control has left the package zipped, and in the installed folder, packages folder, now there's no loose package file for it to load and your plugin is broken. And after loading that, as we can see, that actually loaded that text. We can do the opposite of this. That's taking something and encoding it as JSON. We can actually say scheme data is equal to sublime.decode value, and the value that it will decode is the JSON data. And now again, we change that to scheme data. And when I do it, we have a dictionary now of things. So we get the color scheme from the user settings. Let's say we move this part up there, like so. I'll say base scheme. Let's call it base scheme. So we get the color scheme from the user settings. We find that resource file. We load that into a string. Then we decode it into a dictionary. And now we're ready to do stuff with it. And what actually do we want to do? Well, we actually want to do something very similar to what we have here, but we're going to be doing something slightly different because we can't ask the view for colors. So what we have to actually do is scan these rules to find one that matches the scope that we care about. Remember, this is the scope we're creating a rule for. This is the base scope. So essentially, we would look through trying to find string.unquoted in the scope. And when we find that, then we know this is the rule. And then we can just grab that foreground, background, and font style key, depending if they're there or not. We could even pull in the name key if we want. What we would do is replace the scope with our version over here. Now there's a problem with that, and as we can see, this is the text exactly string.unquoted. So if I search for that in this file, it appears twice. If I search for that in this file, it appears never. But clearly it must, because that other version of the code found something. And this is something that we can do. You don't generally have to do this very often. And what we can do is match selectors and score them. And what that is doing is best described as with an example. Now remember, we can do, if we say view.match selector and we pass in a position, say position 0, the first character in the file, and say text.plain, the answer we get is false because the scope at that position doesn't match the scope text.plain. If we said, does it match source.python, we would get yes. If we just asked, does it match source? Is this a source file? The answer is still yes. And if we said, is this a C# file? The answer is no. So we know it is a source file. It's not a C# file. It is a Python file. This is giving us a yes, no kind of value, right? But that's not what we want here, because yes, no values matching scopes is a direct string match, which clearly doesn't work. But what we can say is view.score selector. And we pass two things. We pass a scope name, and then we pass a selector. So if I passed the scope name source.python, because that's the top level scope in this file, and then I passed text.plain as the scope selector, I did that in the wrong order. I don't use this very often. Oh, sorry. I know my problem. It is Sublime dot score selector, I think, is the magic of that. There we go. Interesting that that actually seemed to do something. Oh, I see, because it does something slightly different. Yeah, there you go. I'd forgotten that that one actually exists. This one does something similar, but it scores the selector at a given point, which is not what we're doing because we're not working inside of view. Okay, but in any case, if we ask Sublime to score the match of text.plain against source Python, we get 0, which means it doesn't match. If I said source, the answer I get back is 8. So the score of that is 8. What does that actually mean? Well, we could probably presume, based on the fact that if I do this, what's the score of source.python? Now it's 16. It really seems like it's using some sort of power of 2. Each one of these parts of the scope is a bit or something. I don't actually know. But as we can see, we get a number value that is bigger depending on how closely these match. So when it's an exact match, in this case, it's 16. When it's a partial match, when only one of them match, it's 8. So if we care about whether or not they both match, the answer is yes, they do, because they made a number bigger than 0. Although in that case, you could use this version anyway. But if we want to know how well they match, then we use this, and whichever gives us the bigger value, right? And you'll see over here, we have a scope, which is this parameter. And we have a scope selector, which is this parameter. So we can iterate through, for every one of these items in this color scheme mapping, we can iterate through these and call score selector and find the one that matches the best, quote unquote, and then use that one. And so let's see if we can figure that out. So here we are in color scheme 2. Now again, this is iterating over that with scope there and selector there, right? So for each one through, we would say what? Matched. Oh, we need two things here. We need to store the entry that matched and the score value that it produced. So let's say score is equal to 0, because 0 is the lowest number that can happen. And match is equal to none. And then we can say for rule in, what do we call that thing when we grabbed it? I'm doing it in the wrong place. Oh, danger, Will Robinson. Back that all up. We want to keep that one pristine for later. This is the one we want to screw with. Gen color scheme 2. Oh, phew, that was a close call. We want to say for rule in base scheme, do this. And what we do is if sublime dot, okay, this score is equal to sublime dot score selector, and the scope, that first parameter that we're passing, is the one from this file, which is rule scope, right? And the value of the selector that we're matching with is literally selector, is that. Now we say if this score is greater than score, then score is equal to this score, and match is equal to rule. Now when we get to the bottom here, if match is not none, then we found something that works. So we can say if match is not none, then what do we want to add here? We don't want to modify that rule directly because something else might refer to it. So we might say what? New rule is equal to a scope of our scope, which is that one up there, the one that's in our thingy there, if you will. So that's going to be the original scope. And then we'll leave the name out, and we can say this. If foreground in rule, then new rules foreground is equal to rules foreground. Now this could probably be very optimized, but the idea is to get something working and then get it working. You can get it pretty, right? And background, and this is font style. So we have a scope that we put in, and we copy its foreground, background, and font style. And maybe we don't even want the font style. We could decide that again on our own later on. And then it can say rules.append new rule instead of this. And as a result of that, I'm going to cross my fingers that I did that correctly. So if I come over here and hit the key, oh, I did something incorrectly. String indices must be integers. Oh, I think I noodled something up there. Oh, whoops. Maybe something like that. Okay. That seems to be doing something. They all ended up being red though. But it's doing something. And you'll see that it used, for the scope entity anchor text, it used red. For entity link text, it used red. For punctuation link, it used red. For punctuation anchor, it used red. So except for the fact that it picked the wrong rule, it actually pulled stuff out and set it up with a variable like we want. So maybe we could just go ahead and examine what the heck went wrong here. Because I'm not sure why it would have done that unless that was the case. How did they all end up being storage? This is the case where a little bit of debugging is in order. We might say, for our purposes, let's comment out those three. Okay, so when we do this, only anchor text gets pulled, and we see that there. And then down here, we can say print just to see what it's doing. And the rule that it's checking is rule name. Nope. Base scheme rules. That's this. Seems like it should have. Well, let's go ahead and just print rule then, shall we? Maybe I have messed something up entirely. Well, I don't know. Oh, is there a rule in here that doesn't have a name? Just for our own edification, we can see it doing stuff here. So the real question is, if that's the rule, why is name not something that works? But we won't worry about that right now. We'll do this. And oh, but I did not save. Oh, I thought. Okay, I see what I did wrong. We don't need to print that. We don't need to print that. Rookie mistake. Match is the one that actually matched. Rule is just the one that it iterated with, so it's always the last one. So let's try that again. Is that doing anything? Sort of. Links are working. And anchors aren't, even though they're string dot unquoted. So maybe my supposition on how that works in HyperHelp is wrong, or maybe I have something else that's messing things up. Is that doing anything? The scope entity anchor text should be set to the text yellow 3, shall it not? But it doesn't appear to be. But links worked. Punctuation anchor text, punctuation link text, punctuation link, punctuation anchor. Might be worth it to make sure this is using the appropriate color scheme. And it is. Oh, I see. It is actually changing color. It's just really, really dim. All right, well, maybe it was string.quoted and not string. Maybe that was my mistake. Let's see what that does. Anything? Bueller? Still yellow 3, huh? Well, that's funny because that really looks like string.quoted should totally be a color other than that. String is just yellow. I may have inadvertently made this code too clever. So let's go ahead and say, again, comment those 3 out. This is again why you would do something like this in isolation. As we can see, we have to, iterate through this a lot in order to find something or find our problem, see what we're perhaps doing wrong. And so let's say print score and match. And I run it. If match is not none, it does nothing. Oh, I need to move it down a little bit. So the scope string has this, for that scope, that one seems to score a little better It has a higher score, but I really would have expected as it to not match quite as good. So let's see. Sublime.score selector. Is this the part that's on the left? And string. Well, by Jove, it does in fact return a particularly big match due to its position. At some level, this kind of seems like a bug. Because maybe I need to invert the order of those two things. Maybe that's my problem. I may have accidentally put them in the other order. Okay, well, let's try that and see what that does to this. Score our selector against this. Does that do anything good? Seems like it did. All right. So there may have been a little bit of a logical fart in my brain about the order of those two things. There we go. So now this is doing exactly what we might hope it would. It is creating a color scheme based on the current color scheme. It's applying rules only for us, leaving the rest of the stuff there, and it's using variables for the colors. So if you were to modify your own, now again, remember, this is in the user folder. This actually wouldn't be, this would be in the hyperhelp folder or something. So you could have your own in the user folder. And if in the user folder you modified the value for variable yellow to something, the strings would change color and the anchors would similarly change color. But if you didn't want them to, you could also create an override on the rules that are used for help. Now, this is, I think, closer to the solution that I would use, but there is one other problem with this, and that is this. Now, I have to look over here because I can't remember. If I do install package, and I want 10% too dull for my tastes, which is something I just quickly selected earlier because I happen to know, oh, excuse me. I happen to know if I scroll past all the blah de blah de blah, I need to copy something out of here because I don't want to type it. This is a color scheme specified like y'all. So it's in the packages folder in a package called 10% too dull for my tastes color scheme, because whoever runs Scotch.io comes up with terrible package names, in my humble opinion. I don't like spaces, I don't like percents. And it's named Scotchy, and the important part is it's a TM theme. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Whoops, I'm going to actually put enter in here. And now things are different colors than they were. So, okay. Now, what happens? Now, remember the code, when I call it, uses the color scheme from the view you pass it and does all this stuff, right? And this is the command we're running, and it is passing self window active view. So that's the file that it used to be, which it's not going to be now because the color scheme's name changed. And I'm going to open the console and run this command. Boom! And we have an issue right off the bat. And I know why that's the case. And there's actually going to be more of them as we go on. And for the purposes of that, we're going to go ahead and do this. We're going to copy that. And we're going to rename it example 2. And bring this one back to just be example. So this is the one that gets executed. And we're going to change this to color scheme 3 on the active view and still do everything that we normally would. And again, this is the code that we were just working on, right? So let's copy that and paste it as gen color scheme 3. And again, just to verify that's still broken. But if I was to comment this entire thing out to there and type pass, that won't be the problem. And now the problem will be that this returns none, and it thinks it's going to try and write a file named none, so it'll have a problem with that. Yeah, but we can see it's calling it. So for our purposes, let's go ahead and just comment that out for the time being, okay? Which means when I call this function, we're going to do that and nothing else. So when I run it, I'm getting still an issue. Oh, because I think I need to return none, or something. It expects 2 return values. So we're not getting an error anymore, but also nothing is happening, right? Now here's the first problem. Run it, and we see that. Now, previously, we just saw Monokai.Sublime color scheme. And it works whether you have the old style of color scheme is the TM theme file. And in that case, the color scheme setting had to be a full package reference like this. But now that it's this new version that combines together with other files of a similar name, that it doesn't do that by default. And I think if I was to, I think I already did that part. If I split this, I end up with an error because I forgot to do that. So os.path.split, the name, second part, gives us the name of the file, which is what that used to be, right? So clearly we can solve all of our problems by saying os.path.split that first part. When I run the command, I get scotchy.tm theme. Now just to show, if I said os.path.split Monokai.Sublime color scheme, I end up with an empty string and that. So if I do that, that's going to work regardless of whether it's either style. So now that part's fixed. So now we can load the resource, decode it, and find the resource, load it, and decode it. Incidentally, the reason that that was a problem for us originally, what did I do now? Oh, curse you tabs. How about that? Okay. This is the line that was throwing an error. Because if I did sublime.find resources, I probably should have explained that better before. If I do that, the answer is an empty thing because you're not allowed to provide anything but the name of the file. So if you do that and then say I want the first one, you get kicked in the butt because there isn't one. You get that list index out of range. On the other hand, if this part was trimmed down to that, now it gives us what we expect. Okay, so now we can find the resource and load it and decode it. So let's go ahead and do that. Boom! Oh, what's this? Well, yeah, because if I view the package file for scotchy.tm theme, it's an XML file. So yeah, you can't decode that as JSON. So that is in itself its own issue, right? There's not a lot we can do here because this is XML. You can't parse it with that. The Python that's built into Sublime does in fact have the thing you can use to parse XML. Parsing XML isn't the greatest thing in the world. More importantly, as we can see in the TM theme file, all the color scheme colors are always the hard-coded, if you will, color RGB hexes, which you may remember as uh, the thing that this was doing if it calls style for scope, which is in Gen Color Scheme 1, like so. We did it this way so that we could find the rules that match the closest and get the variables out so that if someone changes the variables, everything will change. If you're using a really old version of the color scheme like this, then that doesn't make a lot of sense because there's no variables in this at all. So what we could actually do is throw that into a try, and just try to do that. And if that works, then you would also do all of that, right? But if anything in there throws an exception, then that part doesn't work anymore. So we can just do what Gen Color Scheme 1 was doing, which is examining the view and coming up with a set of globals. Now, we don't actually want to do that because as it transpires, as we'll see in just a second, that's not strictly necessary because even though this is a TM theme file, it will still merge with the scotchy.sublime color scheme file. So we don't need to generate globals, but we can do what this is doing, which is still, or sorry, we can do what this is doing, but without the globals section. So in that case, we can copy that, say. Now, this isn't actually how you do that, of course, but we're running out of time on the stream. And you would actually paste that here and indent it and change that. So what is this doing? Now, again, this is an example of something that probably will work, but at the same time doesn't look good. And remember the mantra, make it work, then make it look good. And we've seen that, several times. So try to find the resource, then load it, then decode it. Then from there, if those 3 lines work, we create the scheme, we scan through all of the rules, finding the things with the variables, and return the color scheme, which is the thing we just did. If anything in there throws an exception, and in this particular case, in this example, we know find resources, that's not going to throw an exception. It's going to find the color scheme because we were very careful about splitting the path on it. It's going to be able to load the resource because it is still a file. It doesn't matter what the format is, it's still a file that it loads as a string. Where it's going to throw an error is decode value when it tries to decode this as JSON and it can't. And if that's the case, it skips down to here where it creates a schema and rules, which again is the same as that. So this could actually be hoisted out as a cleanup option. And then it's going to do that. We don't want to add globals. We just want to find the appropriate style and then shoot it out. So now, And for this, I'm going to I need to have this file be the file that's selected because this is going to invoke oh, I need to fix some stuff here too, don't I? I need to put that part back now that we know that that will probably do something. That seems like it might be important. It's going to create the color scheme based on the active scheme, so I'm going to do that here. Now, I don't know what the storage scope looks like, but this is the string, this color that I don't even know if you can see that this has a slightly different color, but it does. And that's going to be the quoted string that the anchor color becomes. So I'm going to push the key and see what happens. Well, I didn't see an error, but in order to see what happened, we need to VPF Scotchy. Oh, I see. So that is one extra issue that I had forgotten about. It generated the thing like we wanted it to. It's got colors in there, and look, the links are going to be italicized apparently, but it has the wrong extension. So let's, oh, I can't delete that, huh? All right, well, that's neither here nor there. So we need to come back and examine this for just a second. I think os.path.splitExt, does that do a thing? Yeah. So I guess if we were to end up in the exception, then we would say that color scheme is equal to os.path.splitExtension from color scheme, the first part, plus dot sublime color scheme. TM theme files don't stack. Color scheme files stack. Let's try it again with 16 seconds left on my 2-hour timer in the stream. Yay! That is totally doing something that we want it to do. I'm going to go ahead and stop this. It has got 3, 2, 1, 2 hours of coding, and there we have it. Now, again, I don't know if you can tell, but if you examine the color of that and that's not white. It's a different color. And here's the link text, which I think is supposed to be italicized, if I remember that correctly. Now let's VPF again for Scotchy Sublime Color Scheme, which is actually the one that's being used here. We can see the anchor text is that color. And if I just go ahead and temporarily do that, we can see it brighten up to a pinky color over there. I'll put that back for the time being. And link text is indeed italic, I guess. I'm going to comment that out. Watch the link text. Yeah, it's italic. It's a pretty subtle one at this font in that color, but I can make it bold italic, and that totally works. So what we've come up with here is 3 possible ways to generate color schemes. We saw, first of all, what you could do in color scheme example 1 is create the core thing, grab all of the globals out of the style in an existing view, and then ask the system what color you would apply to a scope, and come up with something over there. So the strings are going to look like that. And oh, actually, maybe I should try that just because. I'm going to do this. Yeah, the anchor text changed ever so slightly. The difference between those two is pretty subtle. I guess that is actually slightly more visible now than it was before. But So again, the first thing we can do is create a color scheme completely, including globals, and just set up colors we want based on existing colors. If we weren't doing this, this is a pretty good way to go, perhaps. Another thing you can do is examine someone's existing Sublime color scheme color that they're using, always the base version of it, and try to find rules that match the best so that you can keep the variables being used like so, which also gives you the power to come in and tweak it by keeping the color and just applying an alpha to it or something in your user thing. And because you have to be prepared for people to be using color schemes that are still in the old style, you can fall back to doing it the way we did it originally, which is create our own color scheme by asking the view for what colors it would use for various items, and then just generate that and make sure you generate it into a file with the same name as the original file, but always with a Sublime Color Scheme extension, and it will generate you a file like that. Now here you lose the value of variables, but there wasn't any to begin with. Now there is actually potentially another way to go in this TM theme fallback uh, thing. And we're going to note if I have this color scheme open, I can say convert color scheme. And yeah, let's use HSL variables as colors. And this is an example of a color scheme that's broken. You can see I got a problem here. Value error, invalid hex color. Something in here has a hex pair that's not valid. If I do view package file in default convert colors scheme, this is something that ships with core Sublime, as you can see, because this is a sandboxed copy of Sublime. And it has all sorts of code in it that it could use to convert a color scheme from a TM theme format to a Sublime color scheme format. And primarily the difference between that is instead of hex colors, it comes up with variables like this. We told it to use HSL variables. We could have also told it to use hex variables if we wanted to. If you remember the question that it asked me, if I say convert color scheme, I could hard code all colors. These ones are using variables. So if I do hex variables for colors, maybe that will work. I don't think so. No, it still has an invalid hex color. And if I hard code all colors, we end up with a version of the Sublime color scheme that just has everything hard coded. Now the problem, again, I've looked at this in the past. Some color schemes have hex colors in them. They either don't have a color in a place where they're supposed to have a color, or the hex code they have is invalid. One of the two. And it's on colors in colors.py in line 113, invoked from convert color scheme line 347. So I mean, if you wanted to trace through it, it's looking up the HSLA color from a hex color that may or may not have a valid value, and that's what's this color call in another module in this is what's causing the problem. But this is all code that appears in the default package. Now this is the command. As you see, the two big things that it does besides is convert the colors to variables in HSL syntax or hex syntax, or it just does this and just keeps the colors exactly identical. The other thing it does is change the name of some of the global keys, because here we can see that this is line underscore highlight, and here it's line highlight. In TM theme files, it's camel case, and in Sublime color scheme files, all the camel cased things are snake cased instead. So this code here has a list of settings and how they map back and forth. And the settings that are non-color settings that are something different. And this all code here is responsible for creating a new view, focusing it, setting it to the JSON syntax, appending the Sublime color scheme code, which is this, all of this code up here generated, and then setting the name to an appropriate thing. So by extracting this part and maybe including some of that other stuff, we could, in theory, come up with a JSON version of a TM theme file. And if we did, it would be a string like this. We, of course, have to make sure that we don't open a tab and show it. No one wants to see that. And we don't need to persist it to disk. But we would end up with a version like this that has the layout that we expect, like Monakai had. And then the part in the try would work. So we could have try, do that, except do this to create a JSON version from a TM theme file. And then all of this part just follows on. And it's also worth noting that this is smart enough to use an ordered dictionary in it, as we can see for the globals and whatnot, or for the globals, so that the keys that fall out are in the order we expect: name, author, globals, rules. Where if you remember when we did that ourselves in our own syntax, that wasn't the case. Author, name, not name, author. And rules are here because it's putting them in alphabetical order. It's doing extra work. Or perhaps, that's what some regular expressions in here are doing. In any case, this code is an example of that. So I leave it to you. If you were creating something like this example code, would you care if people using a TM theme had variables defined or not? Certainly, they're not going to get a lot of benefit out of that because their core color scheme already doesn't have variables. For that reason, I would say it's not worth it. Now, the only thing that this leaves out is in what situation would you call this gen color scheme 3? And for our purposes in HyperHelp, if we decide that this is how it's going to work, that would be part of the bootstrap code. As it's generating its Sublime package file, it would call this to be able to grab information. Now, this does need a view, theoretically, for this fallback option. And in that case, what you can do is if you create an output panel that appears in here, or that would appear in here, you can make it unlisted. That makes it a panel, much like the console type panel that would appear at the bottom. It's a regular view. You can put whatever you want in it, but you can make it unlisted so Sublime doesn't show it in that menu. So I would do that and apply the appropriate color scheme value to it and use this view for that fallback. But that is something that we will view in another live stream sometime later on. And that is the end of this live stream. Remember, if you like this and you want to see more of them, subscribe, thumbs up. There's another channel. You can subscribe to that. Just as a note, live streams all through November are on Sundays and Wednesdays at 8 p.m. PST. So feel free to hop on in, or if you have questions. And in December, I'm doing one live stream a day with a minimum time of an hour instead of 2 hours to work on my November project. And in that case, I'm not sure if I'll be doing it in this exact style. Probably I will be, and maybe they'll end up being 2 hours anyway. But because I'm working on that every day, videos on the first channel, the primary channel, will suffer a little bit, and they have been suffering a little bit recently because I have with the holidays coming up and getting ready to go on some vacations and things being crazy at work, I don't have a lot of time to to work on stuff outside of live streams, but that is going to change. Until the next live stream, I would like to request that you have a sublime day.